Story 1: The Hidden Waterfall. Back in the late 90s, before smartphones and GPS were a thing, a group of my friends and I decided to head out to East Tennessee to find a hidden waterfall we'd heard about from some classmates. It was one of those locals-only spots, tucked away deep in the woods. The plan was simple: drive out to the trailhead, hike in, and spend the day at the falls. But nothing about that trip went according to plan. First, we were riding in my old junker of a car, a beat-up Pontiac with a gas gauge that couldn't be trusted. I'd been meaning to fix it, but you know how it goes. We were maybe an hour into the trip when the car sputtered and rolled to a stop on a lonely two-lane back road surrounded by nothing but trees and hills. It was obvious. We'd run out of gas. We sat there for a few minutes, debating what to do. One of my friends, Tyler, swore he remembered seeing a general store about 3 or 4 miles back. "It's gotta have gas," he said, though none of us could remember seeing pumps. Since there wasn't any other choice, Tyler and I decided to hoof it back to the store, while my other 2 friends, Brian and Jenna, stayed with the car. The walk felt longer than it should have, and by the time we reached the store, we were both exhausted. It was an old building with faded paint and a crooked sign that just read, "General Store." There was one gas pump out front, the kind with a rusty lever on the side. Inside, the place was dimly lit, cluttered, and smelled like old wood and motor oil. A man stood behind the counter, probably in his late 50s or 60s, with wild gray hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't smile. "Help you boys?" he asked, voice gravelly. "We ran out of gas," I said, holding up the empty can we'd brought. "Can we fill this up?" "Sure thing," he said, nodding toward the pump. Relief washed over me until Tyler checked his wallet and realized he didn't have any cash. Neither did I. I explained the situation, expecting the guy to kick us out, but instead, he just stared at us for a long moment before saying, "Tell you what, I'll give you $20 worth of gas on credit. Fill your car up, drive to the bank in town, get cash, and bring it back to me. Deal?" It sounded more than fair. We thanked him profusely, filled the gas can, and started the long walk back to the car. That's when things got weird. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the woods beside us. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the steps were deliberate, heavy, and kept pace with us as we walked. Tyler and I glanced at each other, picking up the pace. The footsteps quickened, too. "Is someone there?" Tyler called out, his voice shaky. No response. We started jogging, the gas can sloshing between us, but the sound stayed with us, shadowing us through the trees. Then Tyler tripped. He went sprawling, spilling some of the gas, and as I helped him to his feet, the footsteps stopped. But before we could breathe a sigh of relief, a figure emerged from the woods. It was the man from the store. Only now, he was holding a shotgun. "What the hell are you boys doing?" he barked, his voice harsher than before. "You think you can just rob me blind and walk away?" "What? No. You said we could take the gas and pay you back," I stammered, my heart pounding. "Don't lie to me," he snarled, pointing the gun squarely at us. "You think I don't know a couple of thieves when I see 'em?" Tyler and I tried to explain, but he wasn't listening. He kept accusing us, his finger twitching near the trigger. Realizing we were getting nowhere, Tyler whispered, "Leave the gas. Let's go." We dropped the can and bolted into the woods. The man shouted after us, but he didn't fire. We ran blindly, crashing through brush and branches until we were sure he wasn't following us. Exhausted, we waited in the woods for what felt like an hour before finally creeping back to the road. That's when we saw it. My car, cruising toward us, with Jenna behind the wheel. We flagged them down, and when we climbed inside, we bombarded them with questions. How did you get gas? What happened? Did that guy come by? Brian and Jenna were just as confused as we were. They explained that about 20 minutes after we'd left, the man from the store had shown up at the car with the gas can. He'd claimed he found it on the side of the road after we left his store. He just walked up, filled the tank, and left without saying much, Brian said, shaking his head. Tyler and I were stunned. That's not what happened at all, I said, recounting the bizarre encounter with the shotgun. Jenna's face turned pale. Why would he chase you into the woods, then bring us gas like nothing happened? None of us had an answer, but the situation only got stranger when we decided to return to the store to confront him. The building was dark, and a different man, a younger guy in a clean button-up shirt, was locking up. He seemed surprised to see us. The store's closed on Sundays, he said. I just came by to check the till. We told him everything, and his face grew pale. He called the local sheriff, who showed up and listened to our story. What they pieced together was chilling. The man we'd encountered wasn't the owner or even an employee. He'd likely been trying to rob the place when we walked in and played along to avoid suspicion. Why he chased us into the woods, then delivered the gas to our car, no one could explain. As the sheriff put it, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I don't think you were the only ones. We drove away in silence, the weight of the encounter sinking in. To this day, I don't know what that man's intentions were, or why he let us go. Story 2. The Broken Down Van. I've always prided myself on finding the most scenic routes for our road trips. No highways, no fast food stops, just winding back roads in small towns you'd never see otherwise. My wife, Kara, loved it too. At least she used to. But that night in the Nevada desert, I finally started to regret it. We were about halfway through our trip, somewhere between two dots on the map that barely counted as towns. Our vintage camper van, a 1976 beauty I'd spent months fixing up, had been running like a dream until it suddenly started sputtering. At first, I thought it was a bad spark plug, then maybe the fuel filter. But after about 20 minutes of tinkering with my flashlight in my teeth, I realized it was beyond anything I could fix. No service? Kara asked from the passenger seat, holding up her phone. I shook my head, showing her mine too. Nothing but no signal. We'd passed a tiny gas station about 5 miles back, but it was already late, and I didn't feel like wandering around the desert at night. Let's just sleep here, I said, trying to sound confident. We'll head back in the morning. Kara didn't argue, but I could tell she wasn't happy. We locked the van, unrolled our sleeping bags, and settled in for the night. The desert was eerily quiet, just the occasional howl of the wind. Still, we managed to drift off. I woke up to the sound of knocking. At first, I thought I'd dreamed it, but then it came again, sharp and deliberate against the metal door. My heart jumped as I reached for the flashlight. Kara sat up beside me, her eyes wide. "Who is it?" she whispered. I turned on the light and aimed it at the door. "Stay here," I said, moving toward the window. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see him, a man, maybe in his 40s, standing outside. His clothes were filthy, and his face looked sunburned and hollow, like he'd been out in the desert for days. "My car broke down," he said, his voice muffled through the door. "I've been walking for hours. Can I come in? Just need some water." I hesitated. Something about him felt off, but it was the middle of the desert, and I couldn't just leave him out there. Reluctantly, I unlocked the door and let him in. He stepped inside, shivering, even though the desert night was warm. Kara handed him a bottle of water, which he chugged like he hadn't seen water in days. "Thank you," he said, wiping his mouth. "I thought I was gonna die out there." "What happened to your car?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Broke down about 10 miles back," he said quickly, avoiding eye contact. "Where you folks headed?" "California," Kara answered before I could stop her. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on her a little too long. The more he talked, the more uneasy I felt. He was overly friendly, but dodged any specific questions about where he was coming from or why he was out there. And then the questions turned personal. "You two married?" he asked, his gaze shifting between us. "Yes," I said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Kara. "Any kids?" he pressed. "No," Kara said, clearly uncomfortable. He smirked. "You should. A pretty lady like you'd make a great mom." That was it. "I think you should get going," I said, standing up. "We're planning to head out early." His face darkened, but before he could respond, there was another knock at the door. This one was louder, more frantic. "Don't answer that," the man said quickly, his voice sharp. My pulse spiked. "Why not?" I asked. "Just don't," he repeated, stepping closer to me. I ignored him and moved toward the door. As soon as I touched the handle, I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps coming toward the van. I froze. The man bolted past me, shoved the door open, and took off into the night without another word. For a moment, Kara and I just stood there, staring at the open door. Then we heard it. A voice in the distance, low and angry. "Where'd you go? You think you can run?" I slammed the door shut and locked it. "What the hell is going on?" Kara whispered. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we're not sticking around to find out." We stayed awake the rest of the night, huddled together and listening for any sounds outside. At first light, we packed up and started walking back toward the gas station. The walk felt endless, every rustle in the bushes making my heart race. When we finally reached the gas station, it was empty. No attendants, no cars, just a single rusted sign swaying in the wind. Confused, we walked behind the station, hoping to find someone, but it was deserted. Then my phone buzzed, just one bar of signal. I immediately called a tow truck. While waiting, Kara spotted something in the dirt near the front of the station, a set of footprints leading to and from the gas station's door. When the tow truck finally arrived, I told the driver about the man who'd approached us the night before. He frowned and said, "This place hasn't been open in years. You're lucky you didn't stay here too long." The rest of the trip, Kara and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly avoided something far worse than a broken-down van. It was the last time we ever took the back roads. Story 3. The Locked Barn. We were supposed to be on an epic road trip, just 4 college friends cruising through the vast openness of Montana during spring break. Our plan was simple: explore the countryside, camp under the stars, and unplug for a few days. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty fields, we realized we'd made a massive mistake. The gas gauge on my old station wagon was dangerously low, and we were miles from the nearest town. To make things worse, none of our phones had any service. All we could do was follow the dirt road we were on and hope it led somewhere, anywhere. After what felt like an eternity of silence, we saw it. A lonely farmhouse with a massive barn set back from the road. The house was dark, no porch light or signs of life, but the barn's loft window glowed faintly, as if illuminated by a single bulb. "We'll stop here," I said, trying to sound confident. No one argued. We pulled up to the house, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires echoing in the stillness. The house looked old, its paint peeling and shutters hanging crookedly. We knocked on the front door, but no one answered. I peered through a window, but it was pitch black inside. Just as we were about to head back to the car, my friend Riley pointed to the barn. "Maybe someone's in there," he said. The barn was massive, with weathered wooden planks and a large sliding door. It had an ominous presence, but we were out of options. Together, we pulled the door open, and a gust of stale air hit us. Inside, the barn was eerily neat. Rows of tools, piles of hay, and farming equipment lined up as if untouched for decades. "This feels off," Abby said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like someone's been keeping this place perfect, but they're never here." In the back corner, something caught my eye. A row of cages. There were about 6 of them, each locked with heavy padlocks. At first, I thought they might be for animals, but as we got closer, I realized they weren't built for livestock. They were built for people. Inside the cages were random objects: a single muddy boot, a torn backpack, and a pile of stuffed animals in one. My stomach churned. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of those cages made every instinct in my body scream to leave. "What the hell is this?" Riley muttered, running his hand along the rusted bars. Before anyone could answer, there was a creak above us. We all froze, staring at the loft. Something moved up there. A shadow. A figure. It was impossible to tell. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was an animal. But then we heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing above us. "Someone's up there," Abby whispered, gripping my arm tightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. Then suddenly the barn doors slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound sent us all jumping, and Riley ran to the doors, yanking at them. "They're locked," he shouted. "Who locked them?" Abby asked, her voice panicked. The footsteps above grew louder, more frantic, as if whoever, or whatever, was up there was running in circles. Then they stopped. Dead silence. My pulse was pounding in my ears. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely steady. "Check for another exit." We spread out, using our phone flashlights to scan the walls, but the barn had no other doors or windows. Then, as Riley aimed his light toward the loft, we saw it. A face, pale, with sunken eyes and wild hair. The figure crouched on the edge of the loft, staring down at us. Then, with a guttural scream, it leapt down. I don't know how we moved so fast, but we bolted toward the back of the barn. Abby tripped on a pile of hay, and I grabbed her arm to pull her up. The figure, now clearly a man, but feral and filthy, chased us, wielding something sharp. It looked like a scythe or a curved blade. We reached the cages and ducked behind them, hoping to hide. The man's heavy boots stomped closer and closer. Riley grabbed a rusty pitchfork from the wall and held it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted. The man paused, his breathing heavy and erratic. Then he started laughing, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "You're not supposed to be here," he hissed. "You shouldn't have seen." Suddenly, the sound of an engine roared outside. Headlights beamed through the cracks in the barn walls. A truck. Someone was here. The man snarled and bolted toward the back of the barn, disappearing into the shadows. We didn't wait to find out if he'd return. We sprinted to the doors, and by some miracle, they weren't locked anymore. Outside, An older man with a shotgun stood by his truck, shining a flashlight at us. "What the hell are you kids doing in there?" he barked. We stumbled over our words, trying to explain what had happened. He didn't believe us at first, but when we pointed to the cages in the barn, his face darkened. "You shouldn't have stopped here," he said quietly. "This place has been trouble for years." He wouldn't say more, and we didn't push him. He drove us back to the main road, where we managed to flag down help. I'll never forget the look in his eyes when we mentioned the man in the barn. Like he knew exactly who we'd seen, but didn't want to say. To this day, I can't drive through rural Montana without thinking about that barn, about the cages, about the man in the loft, and about the unsettling feeling that he's still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too far off the beaten path. Story 4. The Lonely Gas Station. It started as a simple road trip, just me and my best friend Lauren, driving cross-country to visit my grandparents in rural Oklahoma. We'd planned the route meticulously, sticking to major highways and avoiding sketchy back roads, but a massive accident on I-40 forced us to detour into the middle of nowhere. At first, it seemed fine, just an empty stretch of road cutting through endless plains. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in shades of gray, the unease began to set in. There were no streetlights, no other cars, and barely any signs of life. We'd been driving for about an hour when the fuel gauge began to dip dangerously close to empty. Lauren suggested we keep an eye out for a gas station, but the longer we drove, the more obvious it became. We weren't going to find one anytime soon. Then, almost like an answer to a prayer, we saw a sign, "Gas and General Store, 5 miles ahead." Relief washed over us as we drove the final stretch. The gas station was old and run down, with a single flickering light over the pump. The main building was a small wooden structure, and a rusty bell jingled as we pushed the door open. Behind the counter stood an older man with a wiry frame and a face weathered by years of hard work. He greeted us with a crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening, ladies," he said. "What can I do for you?" "Just gas, please," Lauren said, handing him some cash. While he rang us up, I wandered toward the back of the store, where rows of canned goods and outdated snacks lined the shelves. That's when I noticed it. A faded missing person flyer, tacked to a bulletin board. It showed a young woman, about our age, with a caption that read, "Last seen in this area." My stomach churned. I called Lauren over, and we both stared at the flyer in silence. The man must have noticed us looking because he spoke up. "Sad, isn't it? Happens more than you'd think out here. Folks go missing, and no one ever hears about it." He shook his head solemnly. We nodded politely, but his words stuck with us as we left the store. Lauren pumped the gas while I scanned the dark horizon, my nerves on edge. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the tall grass. When we were ready to leave, the car wouldn't start. "What the hell?" Lauren muttered, turning the key over and over. It just made a clicking noise. The man appeared in the doorway of the store holding a flashlight. "Car trouble?" he called out. His tone was friendly, but something about his presence made me uneasy. "Yeah," Lauren said hesitantly. "It just died." He walked over, peering under the hood. "Looks like your alternator's gone. Lucky for you, I know a guy who can tow you back to town," he said, pulling out his phone. "Be about an hour before he gets here." An hour in the middle of nowhere with a stranger wasn't ideal, but we didn't have much of a choice. We thanked him and climbed back into the car to wait. The man lingered near the store, smoking a cigarette and watching us from a distance. Lauren tried to keep things light, joking about how we'd be late to my grandparents' house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. About 20 minutes later, we saw headlights approaching from the road. A beat-up tow truck pulled into the lot, and a burly man climbed out. He barely acknowledged us, as he and the store clerk spoke in hushed tones. Then, without warning, they both started walking toward our car. "We'll need you to step out," the tow truck driver said gruffly. "Why?" Lauren asked, her voice shaking. "Standard procedure," he replied, not meeting our eyes. My gut screamed at me to stay put, but before I could say anything, Lauren opened her door. That's when I saw it, the clerk pulling something out of his jacket. A knife. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Lauren's arm. We bolted into the darkness, the sound of their shouts and footsteps close behind. The tall grass clawed at our legs as we sprinted toward the tree line. We didn't stop until we were deep in the woods, too far to hear their voices. My heart pounded in my chest as we huddled together, trying to catch our breath. "What do we do now?" Lauren whispered. "Wait," I said. "They'll get tired of looking eventually." Here's an extended version of the resolution. Hours passed before we dared to move. When we finally emerged from the woods, the gas station was dark and the tow truck was gone. Our car was still there, but the hood had been pried open, and the engine was a mess. It was clear they had tampered with it beyond repair. The fear of those men returning made staying there impossible, so we decided to walk toward the road, praying someone would come by. The walk felt endless. With no flashlight and only the faint glow of the moon to guide us, every rustle in the grass made my skin crawl. My legs ached, and Lauren kept glancing nervously over her shoulder. Finally, after what felt like hours, we spotted headlights in the distance. A truck was coming. As it approached, Lauren and I stood in the middle of the road, waving our arms frantically. The truck slowed, and I held my breath as the driver rolled down his window. He was an older man, wearing a ball cap and a tired expression. "You two all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. We quickly explained what had happened, and his eyes narrowed. "That old station?" he said, shaking his head. "Damn place should have been shut down years ago. Hop in. I'll take you to the sheriff's office." Climbing into the truck felt like stepping into safety, but my nerves didn't settle. I kept looking out the back window, half expecting the tow truck's headlights to appear behind us. The driver, whose name was Frank, asked us more about what happened, his tone growing angrier with each detail. "Ain't the first time I've heard something like this," he muttered. When we arrived at the sheriff's office in the small town nearby, Frank insisted on walking us inside. The deputies were skeptical at first, but as we described the men, the tampered car, and the knife, their attitudes shifted. One deputy, a wiry man with glasses, leaned forward. "That gas station's been a thorn in our side for years," he said. "But we've never had enough to shut it down. Sounds like they've escalated." The sheriff himself came in shortly after, and after some discussion, he sent out a patrol car to investigate. Frank offered to wait with us until they returned. Lauren and I sat in silence, the adrenaline starting to wear off. My legs were shaking uncontrollably, and Lauren kept staring at her hands like she couldn't believe we were safe. When the patrol officers returned hours later, their faces were grim. "No sign of them," one said. "But the place was trashed. Looks like they cleared out in a hurry." The sheriff nodded. "They've got a head start. Probably won't stick around here, but we'll put out an alert." Turning to us, he added, "You two were lucky. Don't know what those guys were planning, but it wasn't good." Frank offered to drive us home, but first, the deputies called a tow truck to retrieve what was left of our car. When it arrived, I half expected to see the same tow truck driver from earlier, but this one was a kind older man who worked with the sheriff's office. He confirmed what we already knew. The car was beyond saving. On the ride back with Frank, Lauren and I recounted everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it. "Why would they give us gas and then chase us?" she asked aloud, her voice cracking. "It doesn't make any sense." Frank sighed. "Probably just playing a sick game. You're out-of-towners, easy targets." When we finally got home, the relief was overwhelming, but I couldn't shake the thought of how close we'd come to disappearing. The sheriff followed up a few days later, saying they hadn't found the men or the tow truck. He warned us to be cautious and avoid isolated places like that. To this day, I think about that night every time I see an empty road or an old gas station. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't run, but I'll never take that kind of risk again. And if you're ever driving through the middle of nowhere, don't trust the first friendly face you meet. Thanks so much for listening to Nightmare Narratives. We hope you enjoyed these truly terrifying stories. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you'll know when we post new videos every Tuesday and Friday at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you have a scary story you'd like to hear read on the channel, email us at officialnightmarenarratives@gmail.com, and you might just hear your story in a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and stay spooky, friends. We'll catch you in the next one.